นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Tonight being the full moon in July, we've come together to chant the Dhamma Chakkappawattana Sutta, the Buddha's first teaching that's set in motion, the Dhamma wheel that continues to roll to this day. It's a time to practice Buddhanusati, recollection of the Buddha, Dhammanusati, recollection of the Dhamma, Sanghanusati, recollection of the Sangha. And in a short while we'll finish with reciting the verses of dedication on this occasion of Asalaha Puja, the full moon in July. And some people, particularly those who are not brought up in a Buddhist family or Buddhist culture, maybe have come to Buddhism through books or attending meditation retreats, may feel that sometimes there's too much ritual or ceremony or chanting in Buddhism, which can be true perhaps, but sometimes these rituals and days of recollection such as Asalaha Puja have a useful purpose. One, that they bring people together and they remind us of some of the important historical facts of Buddhism and the beginnings of Buddhism, the Buddha's life, his practice. And many people find actually when you participate in simple ceremonies, chanting, rituals, circumambulations around the Buddha statue or a stupa and so on, and these can actually bring up a lot of faith, and they're quite meditative. And they don't really interrupt one's training of the mind in meditation or reflection on the teachings, and they can actually have a very powerful supportive role. So we can reflect on this day, Asala Puja, just from its historical perspective. It's the time, the occasion when the Buddha gave his first teaching after his enlightenment. And as we just chanted, it was an occasion that gave cause for light, vision, knowledge and wisdom to arise in particularly the mind of Venerable Kondanya, the very first person to experience the fruits of practicing what the Buddha taught. As the Buddha explained the Four Noble Truths, kind of run through them, Venerable Kondanya, one of the 5 first disciples of the Buddha, listening to the words, reflecting on them, gained insight, what we call insight into the path and fruit of stream entry, where he gained some unshakable faith and confidence in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, and some clear insight that changed his mind forever. And this is very important historically, because it's the verification that what the Buddha had realized for himself can help other human beings to have similar insight. Even though Venerable Kondanya was not yet a full arahant, fully awakened from this experience, he experienced what we say is the first stage of enlightenment. That was the insight that arose for him, particularly coming to understand at that time, at that moment, the conditioned nature of our experience as human beings. All that is subject to arising is subject to cessation. And if we hadn't had Venerable Kondanya, then these teachings and this realization that the Buddha had had a couple of months before, on the night of his own enlightenment, may have just been left there, kind of no benefit to anyone other than the Buddha. So it's vital that human beings can practice what the Buddha taught, and Venerable Kondanya was the first to verify that yes, human beings can practice this and realize what the Buddha was pointing to and penetrate these Four Noble Truths. Truth of dukkha, we say suffering, but dukkha is probably the best word. Its cause, samudaya, the cessation of dukkha, nirodha, and the path of practice that leads to the cessation of dukkha, the patipata or majjhima patipata. Even though it was just within the time frame of one talk, that was enough for Venerable Kondanya to have that realization. So you might assume that previously he had practiced and developed many qualities, important qualities, that were contributory to that realization. It wasn't like he was completely green or fresh in his practice. He was already skilled in the development of samadhi and sila, and had great endurance practicing ascetic practices, following the Buddha prior to the Buddha becoming a Buddha. These 5 ascetics had been following him in the pursuit of various ascetic practices. So Venerable Kondanya was primed, ready for this realization, but still it needed the Buddha to come and give his explanation of the Four Noble Truths and give these 5 meditators, practitioners, things that were unheard of before, because nobody else had ever talked about the Four Noble Truths like the Buddha did that day. So like the Buddha was the spark, and the enlightenment took place for Venerable Kondanya on that occasion. And that gave him unshakable faith, confidence in the Buddha to go on and practice, and very quickly realized full awakening, nibbana, and so did his companions. And others from then onwards have done the same to this very day. So this gives all of us some hope and some confidence that these teachings, the Four Noble Truths that form the heart of the Buddhist teachings, are effective, or provide an effective model for human beings to train, learn about the truth of nature, truth about themselves, where suffering comes from, what to do about it, how to end it. These first 5 disciples of the Buddha have proven or verified that they work, using them as a model for practice. And we recollect the Buddha as well as our teacher, because this was the day that all his personal efforts to become a Buddha, a fully self-awakened, enlightened Buddha teacher, came to fruition, because we say the purpose of a Buddha is to teach others, show them the way out of suffering. So Venerable Kondanya couldn't have had his experience without the Buddha. And it's not as if the Buddha was somebody who just quite naturally from day one understood these Four Noble Truths, was enlightened from birth, this sort of special godlike person. the Buddha himself had gone through great struggles and difficulties to realize these Four Noble Truths for himself, so that he could bring them to the rest of the world to practice, to learn about, practice, and gain their own realizations. And that's also important to reflect on. You know, the Buddha went through many difficulties in his practice. The difficulties first of just getting enough inspiration, energy, motivation to leave his comfortable life in the ruling family of that part of India that he lived in, because he was born, we say, a prince, you know, the son of a ruler, into great wealth, comfort, had power and a great future ahead of him in a worldly sense. But to give all that up, give up his family, his comforts, and go out into the forest, you can imagine wasn't easy. You know, the Buddha still had a human body just like us, so he would feel pleasure and pain. He'd have to give up a lot of pleasures and comforts and go out to live in the forest as an ascetic, a meditator, an alms mendicant, not sure where the next meal will come from. That involved a lot of difficulty, mental strength, physical endurance to do. And then he spent 5 years pursuing what we call the path of self-deprivation, as we just chanted, developing various ascetic practices. Actually, before that, he went to live with the foremost meditation masters of the time and learned meditation to develop, meditation to the level of jhana and arupa jhana, the most refined meditative absorptions, states of refined samadhi that were known in those days. He practiced with those teachers, but then left them and went to pursue for many years the ascetic way of fasting, going without sleep, you know, basically depriving himself of all kinds of pleasure and comfort and pushing his body to the most extreme till he almost died, until he realized that wasn't going to work either. It didn't bring him true awakening, and didn't lead to awakening, didn't bring him true understanding of suffering and its cause and how to abandon suffering. So that led him to leave his 5 companions and go off, and led to his enlightenment experience under the Bodhi tree. And those 5 companions at first were quite disappointed with the Buddha, because he was like their hero, their leader. And he had given up the way of practice that they were pursuing, because the Buddha, in his perhaps greater wisdom barami, realized it's fruitless. It's not going to lead to knowledge and insight that will free the mind from suffering. So he gave it up, but the others didn't. They carried on for a while. So after his enlightenment, the Buddha left the Bodhi tree to wander, and he was thinking, who could I teach, who can I help? And he was invited by Brahma Sahampati to teach. And as he wandered, he met one man, one Brahmin, who saw the Buddha coming along the road and saw the radiance, sensed that this Buddha was somebody special, peaceful, radiant, very impressive. So he went over to the Buddha and said, well, who are you? What are you? Are you a god, a deva? Are you some special being? And the Buddha answered, I'm a Buddha. But that particular Brahmin, the very first person the Buddha, you might say, engaged with after his enlightenment, didn't get it. He didn't really understand what that term meant, or that there could be some benefit to listening to the Buddha. So the man went off shaking his head, so you're a Buddha, good for you, and didn't gain any teaching from that interaction. So it's the second interaction is when the Buddha came back after his enlightenment to meet with his 5 students in the deer park at Benares. And they, having been disappointed with the Buddha, immediately, when on seeing him coming up the pathway, they assumed they wouldn't listen to him. They weren't going to treat him as their teacher, show him respect. They already had given up on him. But the Buddha had now formulated a plan, an idea how he could approach teaching these 5 students. So he was noticeably more peaceful and radiant than he had been when he left, and they already picked up on that because they're already, very advanced meditators, very wise people, even though they're not enlightened yet. So they sense, the Buddha's changed, and the Buddha indicated that he'd had his realization, and that he had achieved what they were seeking. And he asked them, have I ever said this before? Have I ever told you I've been awakened before? And they said no. He said, well, now I am. So that laid the path for him to start explaining why or how he had become enlightened, why he was awakened. And that led to this Dhammacakka Pavattana Sutta being given, with the explanation of the 4 Noble Truths, and particularly the Eightfold Noble Path, which is the path of practice that would lead us to the realization of the end of suffering. So when we come together on these occasions, we chant, we offer flowers, candles, incense. Sometimes we might think, this is what some Buddhists do, traditional Buddhists do, is what the grannies do. But maybe there's some deeper meaning to it if you use it as a vehicle for your own insight and recollection. It can be a very valuable experience from time to time. So this is why we do this. Even in this period of coronavirus, when people aren't coming to the monastery, luckily enough we can do it via live stream. So it's a time to stop and pause in your life. What is important to you as a Buddhist? What does the Buddha mean to you, the Dhamma, the Sangha? And this practice of recollection of the Buddha, the Buddha himself says it's a practice that can lead all the way to Nibbana. It's a complete all-in-one package. And nowadays people like that. They like shortcuts, and they like to get things that are complete all-in-one. You don't have to have a lot of other things as well. And the recollection of the Buddha is a meditation object and theme in itself. It's such a powerful thought for the human mind to have, to recollect a Buddha, the qualities of the Buddha, the wisdom, the compassion, the purity, and so on, that when developed as a meditation can lead one all the way to enlightenment. So it's not to be looked down on. You say coming together to chant, recollect the Buddha. Our teachers, many of them, such as Lumpur Mun, have used Buddha Anusati, frequent recollection of the Buddha, as their main meditation object. You've probably heard the use of the word Buddho, which refers to the awakened knowledge of the Buddha, used as a meditation word to be recited over and over again as a way to develop mindfulness. We say Buddhanusati. Sati means mindfulness. Literally it means recollection, but nowadays we use the word mindfulness. So recollection or mindfulness of the Buddha, and practice frequently, not just once, twice, but over and over again, as a way to train the mind to bring up this state of knowing, heightened knowing, awareness in the present moment. So there are many meditation objects we use to train this mind, but Buddhanusati and Buddho has been proven in this day and age as a very effective way of training the human mind, both as a way to calm the mind down and develop this ability to pay attention to the present moment by reciting Buddho over and over again, letting go of distracted states of mind, sleepiness, worries and concerns about other things, and then as a basis for vipassana, insight. And once the mind is calm and the hindrances and distractions have faded from one's experience, then one uses this state of knowing, the mind of Buddho, or the one who knows, to contemplate the truth, and particularly these 4 Noble Truths in practice, recognizing what is suffering, understanding suffering as suffering, which is, as we've just chanted, it's what we're aiming to do. In order to overcome suffering, you have to understand what it is first. And to understand what it is, you have to be able to pay attention to it. And that's not easy for human beings because, as we all know, as soon as there's a little bit of pain, stress, suffering in our life, mentally we run away. Physically maybe we run away as well. So whether it's just, you have a pain in your leg so you move, or it's cold so you put on more clothes, or you come indoors where it's warm, or you're hungry so you eat, or somebody says something you don't agree with them so you either argue with them or you try and get away from that person, and so on. Our normal response to dukkha or suffering is not to try and understand it, it's actually to get away from it. And we respond with ignorance or misunderstanding. But the Buddha said in the beginning of our practice is really to learn to pay attention to what is there in our experience as human beings. And to see that our existence as a human being is bound up with suffering. No way around it. You can sugarcoat it, you can cover it up with gloss and fantasy and imagination, but when you strip away all of that by practicing more mindful awareness and developing some wisdom and insight, you can't help but notice that our human existence is bound up with some suffering. What's the nature of suffering? Well, birth, aging, sickness and death, not getting what you want, getting what you don't want. All of us have had those experiences in one way or another, but so often we don't actually pay attention to dukkha and what it is and what its nature is. We just get away from it, blot it out. Sometimes we even try and remedy it in ways that only bring more dukkha. So the Buddha's encouragement to those first 5 students on that night, and particularly for Venerable Kalyano, was to learn to pay attention more closely. And the Buddha had learned this himself. He's practiced for many years, taken some wrong turns, gone through difficulties, problems, but he kept coming back to this sort of root problem, is that suffering. As human beings, we do experience suffering. What can I do to deal with it? And he realized the first thing you have to do is recognize it for what it is, understand it better, so that you've got a chance of understanding, well, where's it coming from? Once you see the problem, then you can start to look and understand where the cause is, what is the cause and what you need to do about it. So Buddhism doesn't begin, what the Buddha taught, it doesn't begin with some sort of high philosophical statement or a lot of theory. It was more an encouragement just to look and observe and pay attention to what is, the way things are. He wasn't revealing teachings from a God, some superior force. He was saying, basically, from what I've experienced as a Buddha in my practice, it's like this. And I found that life is mixed up with dukkha. That was what led me to leave my home life, go out into the forest and meditate. And I found that paying attention to dukkha leads on to good things, leads on to insight, understanding. To do that, I used this body, this mind. I didn't need a lot of external things from other places, other sources, from higher beings. I just used what I had as a human being, a body, a mind, and I trained it to look at it, back at itself, and to understand itself better. And the cause of this dukkha that I've been paying attention to is, I found out it's craving or desire, wanting, that is stimulated from ignorance, misunderstanding of the truth. Our mind constantly gets caught into wanting and desiring. And as long as that is not addressed, not understood, this process by which the mind keeps falling under the sway of desire and wanting will just carry on indefinitely. It's what we call Dhamma, craving or desire. And the Buddha said there's no river as long as Dhamma. It's endless. Nowadays we have all the knowledge we have of the world. We know there are some really long rivers around, the Nile, the Amazon. Australia has so many droughts, the rivers are not that long anymore. They're not doing so well. But there are a lot of long rivers in the world, but as the longest river you can think of, Dhamma, craving, is longer. It's endless because it's kind of self-perpetuating. As long as human beings haven't recognized it as the cause of suffering, it will keep affecting them. So as out of compassion the Buddha was speaking, he said, we're all suffering as human beings. There is a cause, it's this craving. If you can see that and you start to abandon craving with understanding and awareness, you're going to suffer less. If you can abandon a little bit of craving, then you'll suffer a little bit less. If you can abandon more craving, you'll suffer even less. And if you completely eradicate craving, desire, wanting from your mind, you'll be completely free from suffering. He's only speaking out of compassion. But sometimes we don't like to hear these words because we're so used to craving and attachment to the craving that we identify so strongly with it. We kind of sort of know it's the cause of suffering sometimes, but still we're sort of partial to it. We kind of, we like what we like and we don't like what we don't like, and we're used to that, and we've identified with that for so long, not just one lifetime, but maybe for many lifetimes, that it's quite tricky to abandon it, which is the instruction the Buddha gave. First of all, you've got to get the instructions, and that's where our good fortune comes, that we have the Buddhist teachings still available to us. But then not only do we have to get the instructions, we have to apply them. And that's the tricky part. It's like when you get a new product and it's got an instruction book in a foreign language. First of all, you just got to get to understand what the instructions are, but then you actually have to apply them to fitting up that product, getting it ready, using it. Four Noble Truths are like this. We have to first of all hear them, contemplate them, come to understand them, and then we have to apply them, and that's the hard part. Because you're dealing with this very long river. So you need an equal amount of patient effort applied well, and developing this wise attention, paying attention to your own experience. So you need the qualities that support that, the calm and the mindfulness and the contemplation to support recognizing craving as the cause of suffering, and then letting it go, getting that skill and that wisdom to let it go. The way you do that is by developing the path, which is the fourth noble truth. So all this meditation we do, this mindfulness practice we do, the generosity we practice, the compassion we practice, the kindness that we develop, all the different practices we discuss and talk about and hear about all the time, these all form part of the path, which is getting our mind to a point where, like Venerable Kalyano, we can recognize craving for what it is, the cause of suffering, and then abandon it by developing insight. And the insight he developed on that day was the impermanent nature of all conditioned things, body and mind, physical, mental conditions. Anything that arises from a cause in life it will come to an end, will cease. All that arises must cease. Very simple, straightforward insight, but when backed by all these other good qualities that have been developed in the practice, and with a good teacher and the right frame of mind, that simple insight is enough to free one's mind from all kinds of suffering and have an experience of enlightenment, at least first level of enlightenment, stream entry. So the nature of craving is impermanent. It rises from a cause. Where does craving come from? Well, it comes from pleasure and pain that we experience as human beings. We like pleasure, so we want that, we want more of that. And we don't like pain. And like Pavlov's dog, we can tend to keep reacting to pleasure and pain through our day, through our life. Sometimes the most refined pleasures, the most subtle pleasures, and subtle pain, sometimes very coarse pleasure and pain. But as human beings, in our experience, it's pleasure and pain from feelings we gather through our sense contact with the world, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, and through the mind itself, cognizing different thoughts, different ideas. We're constantly being stimulated by our senses, and the pleasure and pain that rises from that gives rise to craving. And this is where we can understand craving as a conditioned thing that arises and ceases. But the Buddha gave us some help with this. So the Eightfold Noble Path that we practice, one of the main things we're doing is developing mindfulness and states of samadhi. This sense of stillness, stability of mind, that when applied to this problem of what to do about craving, it gives us the state of calm for us to look back at craving and recognize it for what it is. So in that sense, the Buddha did actually allow a little bit of respite from craving in the Eightfold Noble Path. We're allowed to develop some calm by temporarily letting go of our craving as we develop a meditation object. So like Buddha Anusati, recollecting Buddho over and over again, what you're doing is actually loosening your mind from craving a little bit. Every time you put your mind on Buddho or any other meditation object, at that moment you're going to let go of a moment of craving. So if you keep developing Buddho, 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 craving starts to subside from your experience. The desire mind, the wanting mind starts to settle down. It's not completely gone, it's gone quiet, but you get a bit of a rest from it, and a relief from it, which is useful for us. Because then you can come back and look at it more objectively and recognize craving, desire for what it is, as the cause of suffering. Normally we don't do very well with the Four Noble Truths. We don't apply them very well in our life because we're so caught up in suffering and craving, and the effects of it is that it's all one big tangled mess in our mind. So it's like something goes wrong in your day, like you're doing some work and you bang a nail and you hit your thumb, and then you have pain, and then you get angry, and then you get angry because you got angry, and it's all just one big mess, isn't it? Normally it's like that, isn't it? But if you develop some mindfulness and stillness of mind, which is what we do in meditation, you're developing that ability to at least face and look at your experience a little bit more objectively from this place of calm, peace. Doesn't take away the pain if you've hit your thumb with a hammer or whatever you've done, whatever painful, unpleasant experience you have. It doesn't take that away, but it changes the way you look at it. Gives your mind the time and the space and this sense of peace to go back and look at that experience without craving present, or not getting so caught up and bound up with the craving. So this is why we do practice meditation and develop mindfulness and states of samadhi, because it gives us puts the mind in a very good space to see the Four Noble Truths as they are taking place in your very experience day by day, moment by moment. And what you find is it's possible to separate out craving from pleasure and pain and stop the mind from just constantly falling into craving and its result, this endless mental proliferation, states of seeking pleasure and getting excited and stimulated and pleasure and happiness, then feeling disappointed when it passes, going into feelings and experiences of pain and disappointment, despair. Over and over again, that's our experience in our day, isn't it? Ups and downs, pleasure and then pain, satisfied, then dissatisfied, content, discontent, happy, then sad. When you develop mindfulness and some states of calm, there's breaking that habit a little bit. It's interrupting it and giving your mind a little bit of a step back, like an internal holiday, a rest from all that craving and the suffering it stimulates. You get a little bit of a holiday so that you can look back at your experience more objectively and say, oh, the problem really here is craving. I don't necessarily need to run away from my experience or blot it out or get rid of it. I could actually just understand more deeply what is going on, that when I do bang my thumb with a hammer, it is painful, and there's not much I can do about the physical pain, that feeling, but what I think about, I can change that very quickly if I'm mindful and objective about the experience. And it's possible to let go of craving at that point, isn't it? If you're mindful enough, you've banged your thumb with a hammer, it's painful, it's not good, but then you can let the craving go at that point. And you find actually a lot of things in life are much more bearable and tolerable, and the suffering that we get so caught up in is often quite easily remedied when this system is applied. When the mindfulness is practiced, the path is developed, and we apply the mind back to an experience of craving in that moment, we can often let go of craving, which is what the Buddha said we must do. And of course, if you learn to do that a little bit, you can do it more and do it better, and you get better at it. Which is what those first students of the Buddha did. They're basically, Olympic class meditators, ready to go. They're with a good coach, and he set them off, and very quickly they abandoned their craving because all their training was coming to fruition then. We're not up to that level, so we're more like, amateur, local team level, full of amateurs of varying levels of experience and ability. So it might take us a bit longer, but we can be sure, just like those first 5 disciples of the Buddha, it can be done. That's where our hope and our motivation comes from. Others can do it, we can do it. But we have to be willing to apply these Four Noble Truths and the way of practice, the way of reflecting with them, and in a way that is kind of, ideally we're going for a way of practice that's relentless, to keep doing it and get better at doing it over and over again through our day, through our practice, through our life. That's our goal. So often in our practice, we do it a little bit and may even have some success, and then we give up. It's tiring, it's frustrating, or some better distraction comes along, which is what we call Mara. Mara comes along and says, okay, you've done your meditation for today, now let's go off and have a party, have some food, music, relax a bit. We can do a bit more tomorrow. So whatever we've gained in terms of recognizing craving and abandoning it today, then we throw that all to the wind, and tomorrow we're back to square one. And we often find when we keep returning to square one, it's quite a challenge to arouse the same level of effort every day to keep coming back to this practice. So what ideally, you don't want to just keep going back to square one every day. You want to maintain your practice on a daily basis. You maintain your level of mindfulness, your effort. And that's where this whole reflection on the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path comes in. These are things to be developed on an ongoing basis. This is why every day we practice some meditation and mindfulness. Every day we chant, we listen to the teachings. Every day we put effort into trying to keep the precepts, because keeping the precepts keeps our mind out of trouble. So it's an ongoing practice, and what makes the Buddha is that he didn't give up. He's not a quitter. He practiced until he had removed craving from his mind, and then that was what he was encouraging us to do. So it is a challenge, but actually it's also doable because other human beings have done this. And it does get easier the more you do it. So, that's one of the benefits of the practice, is the more you do it, the more you understand these Four Noble Truths and how to use them. Well, life gets a little bit better. The Buddha said, for Venerable Kalyano, who's attained stream entry that day, listening to this Dhammacakka Sutta, he's not yet finished with suffering. He's still got a human body, and he's still got a way to go until Nibbana. But he said the level of suffering or the amount of suffering left for Venerable Kondanya after this point is minimal. He said it's like, the dirt under your fingernails. If you scrape your hands on the ground, you'll get a little bit of mud under your fingernails. It doesn't take a lot to get rid of that. For the rest of us who are not enlightened, it's like the whole earth. That's the amount of suffering we still have to experience as long as we're not practicing over and over again, falling into the agitation of greed, the despair and unhappiness of anger, the confusion of delusion. These are the three main ways craving are manifest in our mind: greed, anger, delusion. As long as we haven't developed this path, haven't had insight, we're going to keep having this experience of dukkha, suffering, over and over again. So really there's no other choice, is there? Once you've thought through these Four Noble Truths, at least it's worthwhile giving them a go. There's no really other way of putting it, is it? Like, you hear them, and for those who are fortunate, I guess, they hear these Four Noble Truths, they might think, this is worth doing, this is worth pursuing, at least to try and prove or disprove it. And we don't know until we've really practiced with them whether they're true or not. But if you do start practicing, as I said, generally you start to get the sense of the thing that there's less suffering the more you go on in the practice. And you develop joy in so many ways as you do this practice. Even though you're working with suffering, you are coming to understand it, what its cause is, and so on. And it's not totally pain-free, this practice, but it does get easier and more enjoyable the more you do it. And that only gives you more confidence that you're going in the right direction. So for Venerable Kondanya on that night, they said, oh, so much joy, piti and sukha, happiness arose in his mind, that he had great confidence in the Buddha and this path of practice. After that, he wasn't going to stop and give it up anymore. He was sure he was now on the right path. And they actually say a lot of the devas, the heavenly beings around, also recognized this is something very special for the world. Now a human being has experienced the fruits of this practice. It's like this great light arose. We said not just a light in the mind of Venerable Kondanya, but this light in the universe, the psychic universe, arose when the Buddha gave this teaching, because it's so profound. It's like setting this wheel in motion that is still rolling today, 2,600 years later. These teachings are still remembered. We can still chant them, we can talk about them, we can practice them. There's not many theories, philosophies, things that human beings have thought up that are still around after 2,600 years. Most things that people think up disappear very quickly. But the Four Noble Truths as a teaching and as a model for practice are still with us today. So that's our great good fortune. And it's something, say, on this day we can really rejoice in that. Be happy that the Buddha's words and the teachings are still with us today. We can still practice them. And maybe we can dedicate, this year, this Vasa is a time we can dedicate ourselves to the practice of realizing the Four Noble Truths and free our minds from suffering. So I wish that for you all. May you all be free from suffering. And perhaps for tonight, I'll just say this much. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.